Hello fellow psychonauts and archetype enthusiasts. This is Interbeing Art, and I really love elves, so I thought it would be a good way to start off the new year with talking about elves. With this video, I try to cover as much as I can of the history and the symbolism of the elven archetype. From the old Nordic mythology to modern depictions, as well as covering the drug-induced hallucinatory forms, and what elves represented through the ages and phases. So tighten the buckles on your little curly-toed shoes and get ready to dive into one of the most prominent archetypes of humankind. Part 1. Pre- and post-Christian Nordic pagan eras. Elves are a fictional species originating in Old Norse or Germanic mythology, long told through stories with characteristics that changed and evolved vastly over time, and at various points they were believed to be truly real. It is difficult to neatly define the archetype of the elf, as it blends and sort of amalgamates with the vast number of other similar archetypal, small magical humanoid creatures, such as dwarves, gnomes, goblins, sprites, pixies, fairies, fays, imps, leprechauns, mares, kobolds, nisse, brownies, demons, and angels, to name a few. Many of these examples are in a broad family of archetypes that span across the world, known as household deities. Elves, like many household deities, were known to have supernatural powers and be either home helpers or malicious tricksters. People thought they were invisible neighbors and worshipped them in hopes that they would protect their homes rather than curse or harm them by leaving some sort of offering, such as a bowl of milk, near the hearth. If the elves were fond of you, then chores would be done while you sleep, lost items could be found, and sickness could be healed. If your family or livestock were sick, things were going missing, or general misfortunes were occurring, then it was likely you had offended the elf folk and they may have cursed you. Folk stories described elf circles or fairy rings, which were trodden circles on the ground or rings of mushrooms, and they were believed to be made by dancing elves. Discovering one would either bring a curse, good luck, or act as a gateway into the elf world. Dancing with the elves is said to be a means of time travel, as months or years would pass after what would feel like only a few hours. The earliest known references of elves in texts from between the 800s and 1000 CE were medical texts, as elves were thought to be the cause of many illnesses and mental disorders in humans and livestock, the most notable being elf shot, what we would now call arthritis or cramps, believed then to be the result of invisible elf arrows. Descriptions of the appearance of elves were also at times inspired by people suffering from genetic disorders, such as achondroplasia or Williams syndrome. However, it is unlikely that it was the initial inspiration for elves. Often throughout history, elves were used as metaphors about real ethnic minorities and filled the role of the other in their storytelling. It is important to keep this in mind as we discuss further the symbolism of the elf and how racial stereotypes created many of the elements that we associate with the archetype. For example, the word elf seems to originally have meant white being and was associated with beauty and seduction. Having elven blood was said to make you more beautiful than most, by Eurocentric standards of beauty anyways. After the Christian conversion of Europe, pagan mythology and traditions became co-opted and heavily demonized. The mischievous nature of elves were ramped up and they became a form of demon, being regarded as eerie, ferocious beings in order to invoke fear and promote Christian values in the population. Often thereafter, elves were said to steal babies and replace them with changelings, as well as being straight-up sexual predators. People began to carve pentagrams, known as elf crosses, on things such as their front doors, in order to protect their homes against the malicious elves. Another variant of the elf archetype described them as basically nymphs, female temptresses that seduced men from their wives. Falling sway to an elf most often warned to have dire consequences, such as years passing after only a short time in their company, or plain and simply getting murdered. Part 2. Victorian and Capitalist Industrial Eras. By the Victorian era, elves became more recognizable as they are portrayed today, being illustrated with pointed ears and stocking caps. The capitalist mode of production of the time and the Industrial Revolution began to transform the archetype. As elves transitioned from old oral folk tales into a more branded identity due to increased availability of literature and advances in advertising. In 1812, the Brothers Grimm collected a set of fairy tales. One called The Elves and the Shoemaker told the story of a poor cobbler who does not have enough leather to finish a pair of shoes. He wakes up the next day to find the unfinished shoes now perfectly completed. These shoes are soon sold and his business is saved. The shoemaker and his wife discover the following night that the shoes were crafted by elves, and so they make them some clothes in thanks. The elves are elated and then never return. In this rendition, the shoemaker gets a happy ending where their business prospers. However, older versions tell a different story. In prior variances of the fairy tale, the farmer discovers a poor elf dressed in rags helping to sweep his barn, and once he gratefully rewards the elf with clothes, the elf bails, yeets on out of there. Seemingly, the moral of this story is that if you help out the needy, they will no longer have incentive to help you with their labor. This is noteworthy because by the end of the 19th century, elves were solidified in the public conception as workers and makers, even though that was traditionally associated with dwarves. It is mostly common knowledge now that many traditions associated with Christmas, a Christian holiday that celebrates the birth of Jesus, even though the actual date of which remains unknown, though most likely occurred in the summer months, originate from pagan celebrations of the winter solstice, known as Yuletide, and was renamed Christmastide after the European Christianization. Pagan remnants include the Yule log, caroling, elves, magical reindeer, decorating evergreen trees, as well as general aesthetic appropriation of Siberian shamanism. By the 19th century, the traditions of the celebrations shifted from a fairly chaotic, community-wide drinking party to a toned-down, family-friendly tradition that was more congruent with commercialism, consumer culture, and the nuclear family. Very soon, the Christmas season was the most profitable time of year for businesses and became essential to the structure of Western economies. The iconic image of Santa surrounded by elves and toys was popularized when it was used as the cover of Gaudy's magazine in 1873. The caption wrote, "Here we have an idea of the preparations that are made to supply the young folks with toys at Christmas time." This led to a portrayal of elves as Santa's workers, resembling a more nimble variation of dwarves from Norse mythology. From this point onwards, Santa and his elves became the staple archetype of the Christmas tradition. The Christmas elf was now a crystallized and branded symbol that has varied little since its inception. Part 3. Post-Tolkien Era. Between the 1930s and 50s, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote the highly influential Lord of the Rings trilogy. These books are credited with shifting the elven archetype from that of a small trickster deity into the now popular depiction of tall, beautiful, wise, and strong warriors, often highly skilled in archery and diplomacy.
I whisper enchantments into the shields that guard the realms of men.
You make money off of that?
This new image created a distinct version of the elf and conceptually became almost the polar opposite of the child-friendly Christmas elf. This inspired much media centered around what I call warrior fantasy, such as Dungeons & Dragons, World of Warcraft, Magic the Gathering, Skyrim, The Legend of Zelda, and many others. Though Tolkien objected to this comparison, LOTR's Middle-earth highly resembled Europe, and its characters are directly inspired by Norse mythology. Because of this, whether intended or not, many racial elements remain present in contemporary depictions and characterizations of elves. The warrior elf is often portrayed as an ideal of Aryan heritage. Tall, shimmering, white beings of striking beauty, with stunning combat reflexes and impeccable accuracy, possessing incredible wisdom and valuing honor. This is demonstrated in a vlog by proud white supremacist YouTuber, The Golden One, in which he expresses his appreciation of Tolkien elves and compares himself to an elf.
A real man is determined by his actions and his capacity for violence, strength, enlightenment, how reliable he is.
It's not your facial hair that determines your manhood. It's your ability to enact violence. This really shouldn't need to be said, but the ideology of racial supremacy is completely based in pseudoscience. It is highly dangerous, and I do not condone it. Here we can see how the deep archetype of the heroic white male appears in a more modern form. This has led many to write and discuss the ethnic coding of elves in recent media, such as Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls series. For an example of elves portrayed directly as a racist conception of the ethnic ideal, I would like to briefly discuss The Legend of Zelda, mainly because I've been playing this series a lot in 2020. Ocarina of Time is often regarded as the best in the series, and to many holds the position of being one of the greatest video games ever made, even though Majora's Mask is objectively better. I argue that it is also the most archetypal of the series, which lends to it being the most iconic and emblematic of the hero's journey. The main character, Link, is revealed in the game to be of Hyrulean descent, which is evidently inspired by the Tolkien warrior elf. Hyruleans are light-skinned with pointed ears, which are suggested in an in-game rumor to allow them to hear the voices of their godly creators, to whom they are allegedly closer than any other species in the land. Similar to the Christian notion that the white male was made in God's image, to be the most intelligent and capable of his creations, the closest to divinity itself. The name Hyrule can also be broken down into high and rule. This land is very reminiscent of medieval Europe, shown as a beautiful, peaceful kingdom under threat by the evil dark-skinned thieves from the desert, a direct allegory of Middle Eastern demonization by Western cultures. Despite Hyrule being what Link is working to save, the game overtly alludes to its dark history. This is most evident in the Shadow Temple, which appears to have been an old royal dungeon for torture and execution. An important point that is not explored in the game, and really made me as a player question whether Hyrule was worth saving. One has to wonder how this Hyrule was established, and what incentivized an entire endgame culture to become thieves in the first place, as no one steals for no reason. Whether or not this ethnic coding was consciously intended by the developers, I find it is a good example of how borrowing from folklore can often bring some heavy, prejudiced baggage. I think they must have realized this to some degree, because future Zelda titles strayed away from these established archetypes from Ocarina of Time. I still adore the game, however I do believe these themes should be unboxed in current discourse. I could honestly go on and on about this subject, so if you want me to do another video on it, be sure to let me know in the comments. Part 4. Psychedelic Underground and Renaissance. The two main versions of the elf archetype that emerged from the 20th century are the Christmas elf and the Tolkien elf. Though these are the most prominent and recognizable in the mainstream media, there exists a much less marketable and a highly bizarre version that has emerged in the underground discourse since the 1980s. These are most commonly referred to as the self-transforming machine elves. In 1967, a hippie academic named Terence McKenna was confronted with a newly synthesized and mostly unknown at the time psychedelic substance, DMT. Being told the effects only lasted 5 minutes, McKenna fearlessly smoked this substance. The experience that followed this action would change his life forever.
You are not having a mental experience. You have burst into some kind of a space. It is inhabited by entities, and there are many of them, and they come out of the background and they present themselves to you. They're literally vibrating up and down with excitement. They're faceted and rotating, and they see you as clearly as you see them. They even greet you. They are truly the gnomes of Central European fairy tales, archetypal gnomes. They are displaying new models of language that have never been seen before. They sing, and out of their singing elfin chatter condense objects which look like nothing at all in this world. I mean, the closest I've been able to come to them are the eggs of Fabergé. You know, these constructs in sapphire and ivory and crystal and vitreous glass, like that, raised to some excruciating pinnacle of completion. It's upsetting. You can't believe it's happening. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance. You could believe this if it just weren't happening to you.
This is the story that Terence McKenna told in his lectures within the underground psychedelic discourse throughout the 80s and 90s, before he passed away in the early 2000s. Many other users of DMT have also reported seeing similar entities to varying degrees, sometimes not machine-like or jeweled, but appearing more traditionally as elves or gnomes, and other times presenting as even more chaotic and abstract than Terence's descriptions. Since the advent of the internet, psychedelic users have begun to document and upload their psychedelic experiences, known as trip reports, onto the web, most notably the site Arrowhead.
This is on mushrooms. This isn't on DMT. They look like gnomes, like garden gnomes almost, with like kind of the red hat and like, except it was way psychedelic and it was kind of geometric in a way.
This has led to much interest in psychedelic archetypes, specific hallucinations that appear more frequently in reports. I have many more videos about this subject on my channel. I was actually pretty surprised when researching this video because I read the entire Wikipedia on elves and not once does it mention hallucinations or any drug-induced encounter of elves. Many a shaman who work with visionary plants claim that the healing work of these medicines are done by little doctors. Even Siberian pagan mythologies have been influenced by shamanic use of visionary plants, such as the Amanita muscaria, which is thought to give the magical power of flight. Highly influential to the Yuletide tradition. Part 5. Symbolism. So in order to organize everything I covered so far, I have created 7 categories to describe the major symbolic themes that have characterized elves throughout history. It's funny because when I started this script, I had 4 categories and it just kept growing. I'm pretty certain on 7 at this point. 7 feels pretty good. Also, they are comprised of subcategories that aren't clear-cut. Often there is crossover between them. Hopefully it makes sense. The first is what I like to call the Puerile Elf. A childlike, playful, and hyperactive sort. These tricksters are morally neutral, meaning it could either be helpful or harmful to interact with them. Very unpredictable, caution is warranted around small prankish beings who possess supernatural abilities. Being immortal, they remain eternally youthful. It's because of these traits that I believe gestures were inspired by the Puerile Elf. Number 2 is Queer Elf. There has been a notable amount of queer coding in stories depicting elf or elf-like characters, such as Link and Peter Pan, which I know they aren't actually elves in canon, but they carry a lot of the same elements, such as pointy ears and wearing green, so don't at me. Typically, male elves are depicted wearing tunics and leggings, which, if we're going to be honest, are basically dresses and tights, and possess some traditionally feminine features such as soft skin, rosy cheeks, and long hair with little to no facial or body hair. Obviously, none of these traits are inherently gay, but in the dominant contemporary social consciousness, these traits are typically perceived as feminine, like male homosexuality, and are therefore equated. Despite being a boy in the story, the role of Peter Pan is traditionally played by a woman, which contributes to the overall feminization of the character. In my humble opinion, I suspect that if anything, Link and Peter Pan are coded as transmask NBs. Another coded elf character is Hermie from the 1964 TV movie Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Hermie secretly wishes to live as a dentist, rather than in Santa's workshop with his fellow elves. He attempted to be honest and live his truth, and was met with ridicule and rejection, causing him to self-impose an exile in order to protect himself from further emotional abuse. He was targeted because he looked and behaved differently than the rest of Santa's elves, and knew that he wanted something beyond what he had been taught was acceptable. This is a direct allegory to being a closeted queer person, pushed away from their family or community by bullying and attempts at conversion. Lastly, the term fairy, which in some languages is interchangeable with the word elf, in English is slang for a homosexual man. Furthermore, the Romantic era of art often depicted female fairies in a sapphic manner. I don't think it's a coincidence. Or is that just me? Number 3 is the heroic elf. The most notable example of this archetype being the Post-Tolkien elf, as I described earlier. Tall, beautiful, strong, cunning, agile, imperious, and almost always white and male. Though, thanks to shows like Netflix's Dragon Prince, that is beginning to change, as we get to see more BIPOC elf representation. There has also been a decent increase in heroine elves, which is super badass, and I am here for it. Though not inherently, the heroism, elegance, and stature of the white elf tends to represent a Nordic and Aryan ideal to many racial supremacists.
An elf is an Übermensch, it's an overman who is disciplined and orderly and is as far from a subhuman as is possible.
The fourth is the worker elf. This type is usually depicted as a very enthusiastic, energetic, and proud laborer who can use supernatural powers to accomplish tasks faster and better than human mortals. This is heavily a result of the capitalist mode of production, where a small minority owns the means of production, i.e. the factory and resources, through privatization. Elves possessing magical abilities became a symbol of the capitalist ideal employee. A submissive, happy, productive, and highly skilled worker. Private owners, like Santa Claus, inherit the majority of the rewards and recognition for the product of their labor, though it is the employed elves that face the brunt of the physical work. Much like the Oompa Loompas of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, the elves in Santa's shop were deceived, led to believe that working for a private owner would provide shelter and protection in a mutually equal exchange. Yay, job creators! Though Santa's Workshop seems to be a non-profit organization, the fact that a group of elves are just grateful to serve their master is unlikely and implies there must be some, typically artificially made, incentive to being employed. Sometimes elves, such as in the shoemaker story, are depicted as being poor and in rags.
Master has given Dobby a shock.
Also, being small symbolically lends to perceived hierarchies of dominance and submission in human psychology, because if the workers were taller than their boss, it could create fear of overpowerment within the upper class. Uniting and unionizing gives the working class the power to gain communal ownership of the means of production, ensuring resources are distributed to each according to their need, and tasks done by each according to their ability. So the capitalists fight back through use of misleading propaganda that reinforces meritocracy, the idea that a small class are objectively more worthy of resources and benefits, while working class folks deserve their insufficient rations.
If you're not greedy, you will go far. You will live in happiness too, like the Oompa Loompa Doompa-dee-doo.
And also tricks workers into believing that they should be happy and are better off in their lower position in the hierarchy.
Who has enslaved to the race of elves?
No, you're wrong.
The truth is, we have outgrown Santa. He needs us. We don't need him. It is time for elves to seize the means for the many. Workers of the world, unite! The fifth is the demon elf, which became more pronounced after the Christianization of Europe. Often Christian demons would be depicted as little sadistic beings that existed to trick, deceive, and harm the common folk. For a while, the presence of an elf could only mean bad things, like bringing curses, illnesses, diseases, bad luck, or death. This was at times also ethnically coded to produce fear toward immigrants or minorities. At many points, elves were synonymous with nymphs, or succubi, where feminine elves would have highly sexualized descriptions and promiscuous, adulterous tendencies. Again, this was used to promote fear, in this case of having casual, unholy sexual relations, mainly fornication outside of the standards of traditional marriage. This type of sexist demonization is evident in old poems such as Elves Could.
Sir Olaf, he rides so far, to his wedding to offer his hand, and the dance goes so lightly through the grove. There, dance 4, and there, dance 5, Elf King's daughter reaches out her hand. Welcome, Sir Olaf, let thy burdens go, stay a little and dance with me. I don't dare, I may know, tomorrow I will be wed.
The 6th is Nature Elf. This symbolic facet of the elf, I think, is implicit in almost every depiction. Elves seem to be rooted in the essence of nature, hence being woodland creatures often portrayed in green. To me, it represents the part of humanity that we left behind in the pre-industrial world. The fact that elves are related to nature in the wilderness just makes the current association with factory workers all the more depressing. At some point, technologically advancing cultures felt that they had separated from nature, and it came to be viewed as the antithesis of civilization, like indigenous cultures, as something to overcome and conquer rather than live in harmony with. This line of thinking became all the more toxic when femininity became associated with nature, which was used as a political weapon in dominator societies against women's rights and humanity, arguing that women and all those deemed as such were bound by nature to domestic roles, such as housekeeping, caregiving, and reproduction. This line of thinking dehumanizes female-presenting folks. Relating back to the demonization category, at various points, women who dared to act outside of the expected domestic roles were accused of witchcraft, leading to scapegoating and violent witch hunts. I find this morbidly ironic, seeing how witches were basically herbalists, experimenting with various plants and resources to create natural tools and medicines. During Scottish witchcraft trials, many witnesses claimed that witches used elves as henchmen in order to spread sickness and dark magic. If we are to somehow rekindle our collective relationship with nature, which would be a lot of work, we could become like natural elves ourselves and help to end the destruction of the world and each other. The 7th and final symbolism category is the Transcendental Elf. Perhaps the longest-standing theme of the elven archetype is the idea that elves come from an invisible world that exists alongside the human reality. This was called Elfland, or Fairyland, later referred to as the Outer Zone, or Oz. Upon entering their world, they would often dance, sing and cheer with excitement, as well as being eager to show you the magical wonder of their land. This facet of the elf archetype is cranked to 11 when accounting for the entities encountered within the hallucinations of DMT. However, when analyzing the history of it, all of the symbolic elements of the machine elves are present. Terence McKenna called the entities by many names, such as gnomes, fairies, or tykes. Yet another name sometimes given by Terence is language elves, which relates to his theory that machine elves were made of some sort of code or information. In this view, the Transcendental Elf, like the heroic elf, represents a human ideal, except not one based in violent superiority, but of one that opens a door in the human consciousness to possibilities beyond human perceptions, and toward an evolved state of being. In this way, the symbolism is similar to the archetype of the alien, which represents the future of technological evolution. One can also extrapolate that if these elves were immortal and exist in a dimension outside of time, then it would be congruent with the shamanic take that the little people are ancestor spirits, meaning that people who have died enter a timeless realm where they can possess any form they choose and return to the mortal plane to act as guides in the living human journey, thus creating a temporal paradox. Part 6. Psychoanalysis. Many people believe that archetypes come from a metaphysical space and exist outside of the human perception. I too for a long time thought this must be true. However, I eventually found that a better explanation for the archetype phenomenon lies within Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious. The hypothesis is that archetypes derive from the innate subconscious psychology of the human brain. For example, the archetype of people turning into stone has been told in many cultures, many of which had no contact with each other. It is believed that this is an allegory for the activation of the sympathetic nervous system in response to danger, specifically the freeze response. Elves are also a near universal archetype, with variations of little beings with similar attributes found in cultures across the world. With this in mind, elves sort of act like a Rorschach test. Inkblots that reflect the psychological state of the individual or culture of that specific time and space. I believe this is the most plausible explanation, that an archetype is comprised of a plethora of symbolic elements and emerged from the psychology of the physical human brain. And we can see evidence of this being the case in how people used elves or mythical creatures as a way to understand many unexplained phenomena, such as weird events and sicknesses. Over time, they became less of a way to explain things or as fear-mongering in order to control behavior, and more of a means of expressing fantasies of a mystical and vibrant environment that I believe many people living through this post-industrial era deeply yearn for. Thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed the ride. I bit off a bit more than I could chew with this one. Sorry if I missed anything. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. This video took many hours to make, so if you want to help out, please consider throwing me a couple bucks through PayPal. Or if you want to be a consistent supporter of this channel, then hop on over to Patreon, where you can make a monthly financial contribution at any price you set, and it will get you a name in the credits. Anything at all is super appreciated. Speaking of which, huge thanks to current patrons of this channel and new patron Lucas McDuffie for making videos like this possible. And with that, I wish you the best in the new year. Peace. There. Thank you.